Greetings everyone. Welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. I am Mehak Chawla, art educator, Bharatanatyam dancer and disciple of Guru Srimati Geeta Chandranji. In this lecture, we will move further from cosmic movement and divine rhythm to devotional play and continual storytelling in Vaishnavism. Vaishnavism significantly shaped Indian dance and theatre through its emphasis on devotion, narrative and divine play, which is līlā, centered around the worship of Vishnu and his avatars, particularly Krishna and Ram. Vaishnavism introduced emotionally rich narratives filled with love, separation, heroism and moral duty. The concept of līlā transformed divine stories into performative enactments, giving rise to the dramas and dance, temple rituals and storytelling traditions. Vaishnava texts such as the Bhagavad Puran and poetic works like Geet Govinda became foundational sources for Abhinaya-based dance traditions. Vaishnavism thus established bhava and rasa as central elements of performance, making devotion both expressive and accessible. From devotional storytelling centered on masculine divinity, Indian culture expands to the worship of divine feminine energy through Shaktism. Shaktism emphasizes the worship of the feminine divine principle, Shakti, as the source of cosmic energy and creativity. This worldview deeply influenced performance traditions associated with fertility, seasonal cycles, and ritual worship. Dance forms inspired by Shakti traditions often highlight lasya, graceful, fluid and expressive movements symbolizing fertility, nurturance and power. Ritual dances performed during festivals like Navratri celebrate the dynamic energy of the goddess in her various forms. Folk and ritual dances across India preserve Shakti symbolism through vigorous movements, rhythmic patterns. Shaktism thus enriched Indian dance traditions with themes of feminine power, embodiment and ritual intensity. From indigenous devotional traditions, Indian performance culture encounters a new spiritual expression of love and longing through Sufism. The Sufi movement introduced a deeply emotional and experiential dimension to Indian cultural expression through its emphasis on divine love, music, poetry, and spiritual ecstasy. Rejecting rigid orthodoxy, Sufism viewed artistic expression as a path of union with the divine. Sama principle, spiritual listening, involving music and movement became a central practice influencing performance traditions across North India. Sufi poetry, rich in metaphor and longing, found expression through music and dance, contributing to Indo-Islamic cultural synthesis. Kathak, in particular, absorbed Sufi aesthetics through its emphasis on rhythm, expressiveness, and storytelling in court and shrines context. Sufism thus expanded the emotional and philosophical range of Indian performance traditions by integrating spirituality with artistic expression. Having studied multiple religious influences, we now study about the influence of Bhakti on cultural aspects. One of the most profound cultural impacts of the Bhakti movement is visible in the field of language and literature. Prior to Bhakti, sacred knowledge and literary expression were largely dominated by Sanskrit, making spiritual discourse inaccessible to large sections of society. Bhakti saints consciously shifted toward vernacular languages such as Tamil, Hindi, Braj, Awadhi, Marathi, Bengali, Kannada, thereby democratizing religious and artistic expression. This shift enabled literature to become performative, oral, and experiential rather than purely textual. Bhakti poetry, composed by saint poets like Tulsidas, Surdas, Mirabai, Andal, Jayadev, and Namdev, combined devotion with vivid imagery, emotional intensity, and narrative storytelling. Texts such as Ramcharitmanas and Geet Govinda were not merely read but sung, enacted, and embodied through dance and theatre. These literary compositions provided ready lyrical and narrative material for performance traditions, directly shaping abhinaya, padartha, interpretation, and dramatic structure in Indian dance forms. Thus, Bhakti literature functioned as a bridge between spiritual philosophy and artistic practice. From the democratization of language and literary expression, the Bhakti movement naturally extended into music, the movement, the most powerful medium for emotional and devotional communication. Music became the most immediate and emotionally charged vehicle of Bhakti expression, transforming both classical and folk musical traditions across India. The Bhakti movement led to the convergence of devotional musical forms such as bhajans, kirtanams, abhangs, padams, shabats, which emphasized collective participation, emotional surrender, and spiritual immersion. In South India, Bhakti profoundly influenced Carnatic music through the compositions of saint composers like Tyagaraja, Muthuswami Dikshitar, Shyama Shastri, whose kritis were deeply devotional and philosophically rich. In North India, Bhakti themes shaped the evolution of Hindustani music, particularly in Drupad and Khayal composition that explored devotion, surrender, and divine love. These musical structures were inherently suited to expressive dance as they allowed elaboration of raga, bhava, and lyrical meaning. The close relationship between music and movement ensured devotional communication between central, which is central to dance repertoire, enabling dancers to embody spiritual emotion through rhythm, movement, and gestures. Thus, Bhakti music established a strong emotional and structural foundation for Indian dance and theatre. As music and movement came together in devotional expression, temples emerged as the primary spaces where art, architecture, and spirituality converged. Temple culture represents the spatial and ritual culmination of Bhakti influence on Indian cultural life. With the rise of Bhakti temples, evolved beyond sites of worship into vibrant cultural and performance centers. Dance and music were integrated into temple rituals as act of devotion, where performance was offered as seva to the deity rather than public entertainment. Devadasi traditions, temple dancers, and ritual performers maintained structured performance practices that aligned movement, rhythm, and expression with religious symbolism. Temple architecture and sculpture played a crucial role in shaping dance vocabulary as karanas, poses, and gestures were visually preserved in stone, reliefs, and iconography. The reciprocal relationship between sculpture and movement ensured continuity between visual and performing arts. Festivals, processions, and daily rituals further reinforced the performative dimensions of temple life, making dance and theatre integral to lived religious experience. In this way, temple culture unified literature, music, architecture, and movement into a holistic devotional aesthetic shaped by Bhakti philosophy. Having examined literature, music, and temple cultures, we now move towards understanding how these influences collectively shaped classical and folk performance traditions. Indian classical dance forms evolved not merely as aesthetic systems but as embodied expression of bhakti, where devotion is communicated through movement, music, and abhinaya. While the Natya Shastra provides the theoretical foundation, it is the bhakti movement that infused dance with emotional depth, narrative focus, and devotional purpose. Each classical dance form absorbed bhakti according to its regional religious traditions, temple culture, and dominant deity worship. Consequently, bhakti transformed dance from ritual symbolism into a personal and experiential spiritual practice accessible to both performer and spectator. We begin with Bharatanatyam, where bhakti finds its most structured and codified expression through abhinaya. Bharatanatyam is deeply rooted in Shiva and Vaishnava bhakti, reflecting the religious culture of Tamil Nadu temple traditions. Devotion in Bharatanatyam is primarily expressed through abhinaya, especially in padams, javalis, shlokas, which explore the emotional relationship between the devotee and the divine. While these compositions appear romantic on the surface, they function symbolically as metaphors for Atma, Paramatma, Sambandha, where longing, separation, surrender, and union represent stages of spiritual devotion. Composition dedicated to Shiva as Nataraja and Vishnu or Krishna as the beloved Lord dominate the repertoire. Thus, Bharatanatyam uses refined gestures, facial expressions, and body language to transform bhakti into visual theology, making devotion visible and emotionally resonant. From the temple-centered devotion of Bharatanatyam, we now move northward to Kathak, shaped by Krishna Bhakti and later intercultural influences. Kathak developed primarily in the Braj region, where Krishna Bhakti formed the emotional and narrative core of performance. Early Kathakars were storyteller devotees who narrated episodes from Krishna's life, his childhood, miracles, and Ras Leela. Through rhythmic footwork, expressive gestures, and narrative abhinaya. Bhakti in Kathak is marked by līlā, playful devotion, and emotional intimacy with Krishna. Over time, Kathak interacted with Sufi aesthetics during the Mughal period, resulting in an enriched artistic vocabulary without losing its devotional essence. Concepts such as divine love, surrender, and transcendence found resonance between Bhakti and Sufism, giving Kathak a unique synthesis of spirituality and artistry. We now study about Odissi, where Bhakti is expressed through lyrical grace and devotional eroticism. Odissi is deeply influenced by Vaishnavism, particularly the worship of Lord Jagannath and Krishna. The Geet Govinda of Jayadev occupies a central place in Odissi repertoire and aesthetics. Bhakti in Odissi is primarily expressed through Madhurya Bhakti, where divine love is portrayed through sensuous yet sacred movement. The relationship between Radha and Krishna is not merely romantic but symbolic of the soul's yearning for divine union. Odysseus' Tribhangi posture, fluid torso movement, and subtle abhinaya create an atmosphere of spiritual intimacy and lyrical devotion, making bhakti the emotional foundation of the form. From lyrical devotion, we now study about how bhakti shaped the ritualistic dance tradition of Manipur. In Manipuri dance, bhakti is not merely a thematic element but the spiritual foundation of the form. Rooted in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Manipuri evolved as a ritual practice centered on Ras Leela depicting the divine love of Krishna and Radha. Performances are conducted as acts of worship characterized by restrained movements, circular patterns, and devotional serenity. Unlike other classical forms, Manipuri minimizes dramatic expression, emphasizing inner devotion and spiritual discipline, reflecting the philosophical ideals of bhakti. Now we study about Mohiniyattam, where bhakti is conveyed through gentle grace and feminine devotion. Mohiniyattam reflects bhakti through its lasya dominant aesthetics, rooted in Kerala's temple and ritual traditions. Devotional themes drawn from the Vishnu Purana and Bhagavata narratives from the basis of its repertoire. Bhakti here is expressed through soft, flowing movement, gentle expressions, and restrained emotion, symbolizing devotion through grace rather than intensity. The dancer often embodies the devotee yearning for Vishnu or Krishna, presenting bhakti as quiet surrender and emotional refinement. If we look in Kathakali, bhakti is expressed through grand narratives from epics and Purans, emphasizing devotion, dharma, and divine justice. Whereas in Kshatriya developed within Vaishnava monasteries of Assam by Srimanta Shankaradeva, who integrates bhakti as disciplined spiritual practice through dance, drama. If we look in Kuchipudi, it is rooted in Vaishnavism, combines narrative, dialogue, and expressive dance to convey devotional stories, particularly those related to Krishna. Together, these forms reinforce bhakti as a shared spiritual foundation across diverse classical traditions. Having explored the influence of bhakti on major classical dance forms, we now move towards its impact on theatre and dance drama traditions. The bhakti movement brought about a significant transformation in Indian theatre and dance drama traditions, redefining their purpose, content, and aesthetic orientation. Theatre, which had earlier drawn heavily from courtly patronage and classical dramaturgy, increasingly became a medium of devotional storytelling and collective spiritual experience. With bhakti emphasizing emotional engagement, surrender, and personal devotion, theatrical performance evolved as an act of worship where narrative enactment allowed audiences to participate emotionally in divine stories. As a result, theatre and dance drama became powerful instruments for communicating religious philosophy, ethical ideas, and social values in an accessible and emotionally resonant manner. To understand this transformation, we begin with the influence of bhakti on Sanskrit and temple based theatre traditions. Although classical Sanskrit theatre as codified in the Natya Shastra predate the Bhakti movement, Bhakti significantly influenced in its later thematic development and performance context. Plays increasingly incorporated devotional ideas, moral dilemmas, and divine intervention, aligning dramaturgy with Bhakti philosophy. Works such as Nāyaṉārs by Harsha, highlighting ideals of compassion, self sacrifice, and moral duty, while Vikramorvashyam reflects divine intervention and cosmic order. In these dramas, Bhakti manifests subtly through ethical action, reverence for divine forces, and the portrayal of idealized human conduct aligned with spiritual values. Temple based theatre traditions, in particular, absorb Bhakti principle, transforming performance into a ritual offering, the sacred performance space, and the devotional intent of the performer. Reinforce theatre as a form of spiritual discipline, sadhana, rather than mere entertainment. From Sanskrit and temple theatre, Bhakti found its most sustained expression in ritualistic dance drama forms. We move to Kudiyattam, which is one of the oldest surviving Sanskrit theatre traditions, reflects Bhakti through its ritualistic performance, structure, and temple setting. Performed traditionally in temple theatres, which is Kutambalams, Kudiyattam integrates elaborate abhinaya to convey devotional and ethical themes drawn from epics and Purans. Characters embody ideals of devotion, righteousness, and surrender to divine will, and the performance is treated as a sacred act. Bhakti here is internalized, expressed through controlled emotion, detailed facial expression, and symbolic gestures, reinforcing the spiritual dimensions of theatre. While Kudiyattam emphasizes ritual and restraint, Bhakti takes on a visually grand and dramatic form in Kathakali. In Kathakali, Bhakti is expressed through epic and Puranic narrative that emphasizes devotion, dharma, and cosmic struggle between good and evil. Stories from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavad Puran are enacted with heightened stylization, elaborate costumes, and codified gestures. Heroes and devotees are portrayed as embodiments of bhakti and moral virtue, while antagonists represent ego and adharma. Kathakali's powerful visual language combined with intense abhinaya transformed the performance into a didactic and devotional spectacle, reinforcing bhakti ideals through theatrical grandeur. Moving beyond the temple and courtly court, bhakti also allowed shape the community-based narrative theatre forms. Yakshagana, a vibrant dance drama tradition of Karnataka, illustrates how bhakti became a popular and communal form of theatre. Performed in open spaces, often overnight, Yakshagana dramatizes episodes from epics and Purans with strong devotional undertones. Bhakti in Yakshagana is communicated through music, dialogue, improvisation, and dynamic movement, allowing audience to emotionally engage with divine narratives. The emphasis on moral instruction and devotion aligns Yakshagana closely with Bhakti objectives of making spiritual ideas accessible to the masses. From regional dance dramas, Bhakti was now extended to folk and community theatre traditions. Bhakti exerted a profound influence on folk theatre and devotional enactment across India. Forms such as Ram Leela and Ras Leela emerged directly from Bhakti traditions, transforming sacred narratives into collective devotional experiences. These performances are not staged for aesthetic appreciation alone, but are treated as acts of worship, where performers and spectators alike participate as devotees. Through repetition, music, dialogue, and movement, Bhakti based folk theatre reinforced religious values, social cohesion, and cultural continuity at the community level. Now we move on to study the social influence of Bhakti as expressed through dance and theatre. One of the most significant social contribution of the Bhakti movement was the democratization of spiritual expression. Through dance, music, and theatre, devotional ideas reached people across caste, gender, and class boundaries. Bhakti saints and performers challenged rigid social hierarchies by asserting that devotion, rather than birth or social status, determined spiritual worth. Artistic expression within this framework encouraged broader participation in devotional life, allowing spiritual engagement to move beyond elite or restricted circles. The performer was no longer viewed merely as an entertainer, but as a bhakta whose art functioned as an offering to the divine. This shift elevated the moral and spiritual dimension of artistic practice and transformed performance into a powerful medium of social reform, promoting ideals of equality, compassion, and collective devotion. From social transformation, we now move to the aesthetic orientation brought about by Bhakti. Bhakti introduced a radical transformation in the aesthetic understanding of Indian performing arts by redefining the relationship between emotion, expression, and spirituality. Traditional aesthetic theory, as outlined in the Natya Shastra, emphasized the experience of rasa as the ultimate goal of performance. Bhakti expanded this framework by infusing rasa with spiritual meaning, particularly through the elevation of Shringara from erotic love to divine love. The longing of the devotee for the deity was expressed through Nayaka imagery, transforming personal emotion to metaphysical devotion. Dance and theatre thus became mediums for experiencing not only aesthetic pleasure but also spiritual transcendence. This aesthetic shift leads us to a deeper engagement with Bhakti relationship to rasa theory. Within classical aesthetic discourse, Bhakti occupies a unique position while it utilizes established rasas, especially Shringara, Karuna, and Shanta. It ultimately transcends them. Scholars and practitioners often describe Bhakti as an emotion that goes beyond aesthetic experience, as it does not culminate merely in artistic enjoyment, but lead toward spiritual realization. In this context, Abhinaya evolved from dramatic representation into spiritual communication, enabling the performer to convey inner devotion and the audience to experience emotional identification with the divine. The fusion of bhava, rasa, and spirituality creates a heightened state of awareness where art becomes a path towards inner transformation. Having studied aesthetic philosophy, we return to broader social implications of Bhakti enacted through performances. Through performing arts, Bhakti became a lived social experience rather than an abstract philosophy. Dance and theatre performances facilitated the breakdown of caste barriers by encouraging collective participation and shared devotion. The identification of the performer as a bhakta reinforced humility, discipline, and ethical responsibility, ensuring that arts serve a higher and moral purpose. Consequently, performing arts functioned as powerful instruments of social cohesion and reform, fostering empathy and cultural continuity. With this, I conclude my lecture. Thank you.